Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. Shasta and I will be with you in just a few minutes while people are jumping on board. All right, well, I still see some people coming on, but maybe we ought to go ahead and get started.
Okay, so good morning, everybody, and welcome. The last 5 webinars, we've gone through our introductions, of course, and the different impacts and effects of climate change that we are potentially dealing with in our adaptation strategies. And so now's the time to put the pencil to the paper and start talking about how we actually do our assessments to figure out what each of us in our different communities are potentially going to be facing. So that's part 1, how to do a vulnerability assessment. So I'm glad you're here. This is really where we're going to start, where the rubber meets the road, as they say. So Angie, go ahead.
All right, hi again, everybody. So this is webinar 6. So now we've passed the halfway point. Like Shasta said, we've gone through giving you a basic understanding of all the climate exposures and impacts, and now we get to really start applying it. This is I really like this part of the training because we get to turn our attention to action, and so we get to talk about all the ways that communities are not just identifying what's going on, what the impacts that are coming to them, but addressing them too. So and there's lots and lots of ways to address all those impacts that may have seemed scary as we talked about over the last few webinars, but now we get to take steps to address them. And so this webinar today will take us through the first couple of steps on vulnerability assessments, and then we'll do the rest of the steps in the next piece. The next webinar, part 2 on the vulnerability assessments, we get to dive deep on data and information gathering and analysis, and we'll do some a little bit more interactive activities with data. So I'm excited about that too. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so as always, we like to start with our suggested readings. And last time we left you with a suggested reading from the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. It's called the Tribal Climate Change Guidebook. And we just suggested you read 3 pages, and those 3 pages were on community engagement. And it's an important piece of what we're going to talk about today, so it's a good lead up to our conversation. So as always, in the question box, if you can go ahead and share some thoughts on the reading, could be anything, but the discussion basically is, did anything surprise you? What did you learn? So share some thoughts with us over there on the right. And basically this part of the Tribal Climate Change Guidebook just does a nice, concise job of providing you with the different tips for how and when you can conduct community engagement during adaptation planning. And I like it because it puts it really early on in the process. It gives it a good weight of importance because it really is an important piece. And in some cases, can be a time-consuming piece that we really need to be planning for. And so it also provides case studies, it provides links to resources. And so I wanted to make sure you're aware of this resource, the Tribal Climate Adaptation Guidebook. We don't pull from it, line for line or anything for this training, but we definitely agree with what's in here. And so sometimes we'll reference it throughout. So Shasta, are you seeing anybody chiming in with any comments?
Not just yet, but just looking at the guiding questions for reading those pages, I can say for my own perspective that these are questions we hear and that I talk about with my colleagues all the time. And that is how to engage the members of our community in these discussions. And it's one thing to sit at our desks and talk to our staff or the other people that we work with in other communities about how to engage with our communities, or I should say about what we're going to do. But then we have to take it out and talk to people. So if we were in a classroom right now, I would say show of hands, who thinks it's easy to go out and engage with your community? And more often than not, I only get one or two hands, and then I realize those people have been tricked. If it's easy to engage with your community and you raised your hand, then you need to tell the rest of us how it's done, because it's not easy. And I find that in my case, trying to lure people into a meeting talking about climate change is, even with you, when you have food, even when you offer free giveaways, people don't really want to talk about it. So I'm not seeing anybody else type anything in, but just as we go forward, if you have any suggestions or thoughts or questions about that, feel free to throw them in the box and I'll read them out as they come up.
Yeah, there are opportunities today to share your thoughts on how you meaningfully engage your community. If you have tips, you have chances to suggest that. These guiding questions, this is coming out of the Tribal Climate Adaptation book. This is just a list of suggestions for what you might consider as you're thinking about starting community engagement. And so it's thinking about who are the key groups and what information do you need for these groups? What are the best approaches? So I just think it's a good list of questions that keep in your back pocket as you start thinking through who you would engage in your climate adaptation planning processes. But we're going to get into a lot more detail about all that. All right, let's go ahead and dive in today. So you now have seen this framework a whole bunch of times. Like we said, today we get to cover, now we're turning our attention to covering everything that really matters for your community. We're going to look at exposures and impacts that relate to your community, figure out the steps in the process for how to do that in your tribe. And so we kind of look at all of it, anything that's relevant, direct exposures, secondary exposures, built environment, natural environment, health and social environment. Although you don't have to look at all of them, you may decide to look at only pieces. We'll also be looking at community assets, because what's really important in a vulnerability study is you want to make sure that you're seeing what's coming to you, and from a perspective of protecting the things that really are valuable and matter and are important to your community. For example, if extreme storms come to your community, but all it did was leave behind fairy dust and pretty new flowers, well, then it wouldn't really be a terrible impact and it wouldn't hurt any of the assets that you value. However, that's not the case. Extreme storms come with all sorts of impacts that are likely to impact the value, the resources, assets, values that your community thinks are important. Things like your fish, things like your facilities, things like your health. So those are the things we want to make sure we identify and prioritize. So we're going to get into all of that. But this is to say that part of the reason for this training is that we know that some tribes have gone forward and done their vulnerability assessments, but a lot of times, not just for tribes, any community, addressing health as a part of that process is often overlooked, but it's really important. Or it might be a small piece of it, but maybe it hasn't been dove into quite to the extent to avoid some pretty significant blind spots in protecting your community's health. So as we talk, we're going to make sure we're talking about vulnerabilities in the context of making sure there's a good focused effort in health. And so, this is sort of a rally cry, but just an important thing to say is that communities that begin planning now have the best options for adapting to climate change rather than waiting.
So we do have a comment here from Aaron Jones. Thank you, Aaron. He says, first of all, thanks for suggesting the read. My project lead has been utilizing a cross-department engagement team, using some of the engagement methods, but with many different faces wearing different hats. So it helps with engaging the community from various levels and people. He says he's referencing page 37 of the reading. And Aaron, I have to admit that, different faces wearing different hats, I'm actually imagining actual hats, which I think might be funny if you had climate change hats, just to try to make people laugh a little bit about a serious subject. But that's just me. I'm a little bit funny in that way. But I think that's a great idea, having different people, so that it's not just always, oh, it's those depressing people from the environmental department. You can get some other folks in there as well. So that is a really great suggestion.
And Aaron, maybe if you wouldn't mind, we might unmute you later when we're looking to talk a little bit in more detail about how to engage a planning team across departments.
Oh, and he says here he likes my idea. That's a great outreach idea, climate hats. Maybe for the next webinar, we can all show up with our climate hats on.
Make it fun in whatever way we can. All right, well, you guys have seen this slide early on in the series, but I'm bringing it back because I just want to illustrate that as we talk about vulnerability assessments, there isn't just one right way to do it. There's all sorts of ways that communities are doing vulnerability assessments or trying to figure out basically what their risks are when it comes to climate change. And so we had talked about different kinds of approaches that come out of different professions or different industries. So a public health planning approach has its own planning paradigm, and it usually involves a community health assessment, which is looking at risks and needs, and might be followed by a community health improvement plan which outlines strategies to address those needs. And that's a very typical process. Figure out kind of the problem, figure out the solution. In the climate adaptation planning world, sort of similar, climate vulnerability assessment, which we're going to talk about today, which are then typically followed by a climate adaptation plan, which is where you think through the strategies to address your vulnerabilities. Also, a community may be doing an emergency management approach. So a lot of tribes have hazard mitigation plans in place. Maybe you're due for an update. And after, so a mitigation plan will identify the risks associated with various disaster or hazards in your community, not just climate related, but should hopefully include climate change projections into the calculation of future risk. And sometimes is followed up in more detail by an emergency management plan. So I have a poll actually I would like to share. And so give me just a moment here. Okay. I've asked a little bit of a variation of this question before, but since we're now diving in to planning, I'm hoping you can share. The tribal community that you're working in has completed which of the following? So a climate vulnerability assessment, a climate adaptation plan, a community health assessment, a community health improvement plan, a hazard mitigation plan, and or emergency management plan. So you, on this one, it's you can choose more than one option, so click all that apply. Which have you completed?
And for those of you who might be working for organizations that assist tribes, go ahead and check those off if you've also assisted tribes with any of these.
All right, so we are doing pretty good. We'll give it another few seconds for people to vote. So anybody's on the line, and if you can go ahead and complete this poll, that'll help us just figure out where people are at today.
We're up to 54%. Come on, you guys, wake up. You can do better than that.
People are multitasking. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead, we're at 63% now. That's pretty good. I'm gonna close it.
67, wait.
Okay, we'll give them more time since we yelled at them.
Yeah, I'll say 10, wait, 3, 4, we're gonna get to 10, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, okay, done.
Okay. All right, let's share the results. All right, can you all see the results?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so lots of people have done hazard mitigation plans and or emergency management plans, 63%. That was sort of what I was expecting to see, that's definitely done more so than a lot of these other plans. 38% of you have completed a climate vulnerability assessment. That's great. We want to hear from you more today and tomorrow, or today and on the next webinar. 44% have completed a climate adaptation plan, 19% have completed a community health assessment. Well, that's great. That's actually higher than I was expecting. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and hide this again. Nobody's completed a community health improvement plan. That's interesting.
Actually, no, it said 6%. 6% had completed a community health
Oh,
improvement.
you're right. You're right. Thank you. All right, so my screen's back up, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, that's good. So we're gonna focus today on the climate adaptation planning approach. That's what this training is gonna help you get through. But if you're from a public health agency and you want to do a public health planning approach, you could certainly modify that to include climate projections, or you could participate in a climate adaptation process. Or say you're in an emergency management role, you can certainly include climate change information in your hazard mitigation plan and emergency management plan. And you can focus on that. Say if those are the plans that are institutionalized, paid for, funded somehow, and you can use those are your only opportunities to embed some sort of recognition and preparedness for climate change, then use the tools at your disposal. We're going to assume that if you're here that you're thinking about doing an actual climate adaptation planning process. And so that's where we're going to focus. But those of you that have these other processes in place, so say you have a hazard mitigation plan, those are going to feed right in. They have a lot of information that could feed right into your climate vulnerability assessment. I use that a lot. I pull from other documents. And so all these things are helpful and they can all kind of work together. Similarly, once you complete a climate adaptation planning process, those things can then feed back out to these other processes as well. Okay, so kind of let's start at the top. A lot of you sound like you're pretty new to the adaptation planning process. The purpose of adaptation planning is it's several purposes, but basically, as we've gone through over the last several webinars, we know that climate change is expected to affect many, if not all, aspects of tribal communities, from wildlife to community health, economies, tribal culture, sovereignty. We've gone over this and many other impacts. The projections that we look at show that these changes will become more extreme in the next decades. And so the goal of adaptation plans is to move communities towards a state of preparedness and resilience. And so the idea with a vulnerability assessment is that your tribe can make clearer decisions about strategies that it will put in its adaptation plan if it better understands the magnitude, likelihood, frequency, and timing of threats imposed by climate change. And so this is where you get to really get clear and custom information about what's coming to your community. And you aren't alone. So tribes all over the country are preparing for climate impacts, their own specific custom climate impacts, by conducting vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. And in fact, the BIA does a pretty good job of tracking where climate planning or resilience activity are happening around the country. So this is a map that comes from the BIA. It's Indigenous Peoples Resilient Actions. And so you can see across the country a lot of different actions. You can actually go to BIA and kind of look at these projects. And I actually just wanted to show you something while we're here. So this is actually the BIA is one of the best funders of climate vulnerability and adaptation planning processes that there is. And a lot of the communities we work with use these funds. And so if you ever wanted to go to their website, you can actually just kind of take a gander at what other communities are doing. So there's category 2 for adaptation planning. You can see like right now what communities are planning to actually do in their for their tribe. So it would range from just a general adaptation plan. I see some people are talking about relocation planning, sad but true, managed retreat. Some are focused specifically on permafrost vulnerability assessments, permafrost degradation. Some are focused more on erosion. Here's one about forecasting peak stream flows. So lots of different ways to cut this process. All right, let me go ahead and kick that up. And I like this quote here on the bottom right from Swinomish, from the chairman of the Swinomish Indian Senate. It says, if adaptation is to be our future, we at Sonoma have already proved ourselves equal to the challenge. In the spirit and knowledge of our long history, I urge those within our community to embrace this challenge and meet it with every confidence of success. That is the true essence of Swinomish. And that's a phenomenal attitude to bring into this process. And I hope you all in your communities have some sense of endurance and resilience that you can bring along with you. Okay, let's talk about phases. So we at the Tribal Climate Health Project had done a lot of research in the development of this curriculum in order to refine and compile from the best practices out there. What are the best practices when it comes to vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans? And so we also had an advisory group because we love engagement. We brought in, we invited like 150 people to join our advisory group. We invited all their input to help us really dissect what were the key elements of vulnerability assessments and climate adaptation plans. And so we're going to go through, these are the main phases, and then under each of these we go through steps. And this is really the basis of the remainder of the training. So today and next webinar, we're going to focus on vulnerability assessments. After you complete a vulnerability assessment, you typically complete an adaptation plan. An adaptation plan's goal will be to outline strategies to address the vulnerabilities that were found in your vulnerability assessment. And then on an ongoing basis, you adopt that plan, you implement that plan, and you regularly evaluate, monitor the plan, how well you're progressing on your strategies, are things changing? And then on a regular basis, some people do maybe say every 3 to 5 years, you might update your plan. And so I like this model because it's showing that you're doing a lot of heavy lifting in the beginning, but there is an ongoing element, but you're not, I just don't enjoy the process of a circle going around and around. You will go, once you go through this process, you will be in a far better place to continually improve upon it. So like I said, to address the impacts of climate change, it is critical to first understand your tribe's most significant and unique vulnerabilities, including health. So we're going to talk about steps. Now, before I introduce steps, we're going to talk a little bit more about what vulnerability means. And in general, this is going to be presented as a linear process, but not all of this has to be done in a sequential order that's this linear. This is a human process, and so in some cases you may do a little piece of something out here and come back to it over here. So though we're presenting it in a linear way, please know that there are ways for this to be flexible. If you have to do something in a different order, you can, or if you have to do it many times, you can.
And that brings up a point from, well, it says ITEP Tribal Climate Change Program, but I think that's Nikki. The circle is an important symbol in Native and Indigenous cultures. The idea of cycling and completion and going around. So it's an important symbol to acknowledge the circular nature of a lot of Indigenous ideologies.
Yes. And it's all over, it's all over the climate literature too. And we'll look at some of those. We're going to look at some of those frameworks as well, because I just want you to be aware of all your options. And so as we go into, assessing health vulnerability, let's just talk a little bit more about what it means to be vulnerable, or what a vulnerability assessment is really designed to do. And so vulnerability assessments are designed to catalog and synthesize information on biophysical conditions, community assets, and other locally relevant characteristics that are likely to be most strongly affected by projected climate changes. And so there's a lot of folks that talk about like a formula for vulnerability in maybe slightly different ways. The main pieces of vulnerability are a formula that basically says your exposure risk. So the exposures we talked about, exposures being climate conditions that could adversely affect your community. I have here impact risk. So impacts are the ones we've talked about that would actually affect the health, social, natural, and built environment in ways that may impact your valued community assets. And then there's modifying factors. So modifying factors would include population sensitivity. That may be a new word for some of you. Population sensitivity basically means the degree to which a species, asset, or resource is affected by an extreme weather event, climate change, changing climate conditions. So you would add on additional risk of vulnerability if you have additional population sensitivity factors. And this will make more sense as we go through. And then you would sort of subtract, so your vulnerability goes down if you have adaptive capacity. And so adaptive capacity could be the ability to address and adjust for the impacts coming your way, or to take advantage of opportunities and to respond. And so this may mean you do or don't have resources, you do or don't have staff, you do or don't have legal obstacles in your way in terms of actually what you can do to adapt. And so those things combine to what your community will look at to determine its level of vulnerability. And then so a couple of questions that are good to think through as we sort of start here. Are health-focused vulnerability assessments different than a regular vulnerability assessment? I would say different in that you are going to actually have a dedicated outlined focus on health, and it doesn't have to be exclusive. But like I said, some vulnerability assessments don't address it, or if they do address it, it's not maybe as thorough as it could be. Or a community may do a complete health focus, meaning only health, which is okay too. And I've seen that. That happens a lot. It's happened in Alaska with some tribes. A lot of public health agencies around the country, mainly municipal, are doing these kinds of approaches. And then the other question is, what if I've already done a vulnerability assessment, but it didn't include health? So, I would say stick along with us in this process, because there are ways for you to supplement, amend, or like I said, these things get updated regularly. On your next update, you could include this information on your next iteration, or do, like I said, a supplement or amendment. Okay. So back to the concept of no single right way to do this. There are a lot of different options to customize a vulnerability assessment to your tribe's needs. And so we're going to introduce some of the variations in adaptation planning approaches. And so, many communities have found that, addressing vulnerability across a broad range of systems, topics, and services and assets is the way to go. Some decide to do something a little bit more topical, but let's start on the right. On the right is some examples of some frameworks. The circular with the 9 steps, that's actually from California. It's from the Safeguarding California plan, which is an adaptation plan that includes health in California. And so they outline nine steps, generally into 2 areas, the gray and the blue, which are more like vulnerability and adaptation planning. Again, in a circle, because the idea is true, that you want to continuously improve upon this process. You want to come back and reevaluate the steps. Same with the BRACE model. You may hear of the BRACE model as you continue looking at climate and health. It's from the CDC, so it refers to building resilience against climate effects. And so it, there's a lot of similarities. So it's talking about forecasting climate impacts, and then it goes through to addressing public health interventions, so strategies, all the way through evaluating impact. And so this has actually been indigenized by the Swinomish community, where they use this framework, but use it in a tribal setting. On the bottom right, that's coming from the Tribal Climate Change Guidebook that we suggested that you read this last time. And so what I like about this one is they start with, centering the tribe's adaptation effort first, and then the rest of the steps surround that, but similar. You're still, first kind of thing you're doing is to identify concerns, looking at information, assessing vulnerability, plan for action, and then implementing and monitoring and evaluating. And then on the bottom left of those pictures, that's the Tribal Climate Change Adaptation Plan template. So there's ITAP, that's an ITAP document. ITAP has a whole toolkit of various tools and resources. One of them is a report template, and it actually outlines various categories of content, and so you can see how what kind of information they suggest implement or content to place into their climate adaptation planning processes. And we'll get back to some of their tools as well. In terms of approach, so there's a lot of different ways to go about a vulnerability assessment. Some people talk about it in terms of top down versus bottom up. That may mean, are you just going to pull a bunch of information, national level information, try to downscale it as much as you can, and make an assessment on your risks from that kind of a perspective? A bottom-up approach might be more grounded in community engagement, grounded in community values, grounded in perhaps traditional knowledges and indigenous sciences. And I guess what we do in this training and what we recommend is that those two things are not mutually exclusive, and that you can do a combination of both, and that we recommend using all the information at your disposal, both top down and bottom up. So then you have to make choices about whether or not this is going to be a comprehensive vulnerability assessment or focused on specific topics, assets, or locations. So for example, topics may be, we only want to focus on health. We only want to focus on erosion. We only want to focus on sea level rise. We only want to focus on what's happening to a specific wildlife species. So those are all fine and on the table. But like I said, a lot of times you can get some efficiencies and some benefits out of doing things comprehensively, so that you don't, you may want to consider whether or not you want to avoid spending a lot of effort, time, and resource on one topic, when in some cases you might be able to do, hit multiple topics with that level of effort. So you may be going to similar data sources for other topics as well, but you may not have the resources to do a comprehensive one. So it's really up to you what topics you will choose. Some of that I know gets dictated by the funding source that you're using. And so maybe your tribe has allocated resources directly and they have a specific thing they want to look at, or maybe you have a grant that you propose for a specific topic, and so now you're doing that. And we see that a lot. Another approach, sort of consideration, is information source type. So you can choose to use all indigenous science and traditional knowledge, or you can also use all Western information, meaning what might come out of, say, local, state, and national level databases, or a braided approach. And similarly, we like a braided approach if you can take all the information available to you and make some sense of it. Of course, we know with traditional knowledges that there are some pieces of information that would be challenging to include in a document that may end up being more public. So those are considerations. The other thing to think about is whether or not you're going to go this alone, individually as a community, or whether or not you're going to collaborate with others. And so a collaboration may mean you've got 4 other tribes in your region that you want to work with, and so you're all going to get together and do a vulnerability assessment together. There are pros and cons to doing that. If you decide you do want to go it together, you certainly can leverage resources. In some cases, that's considered a benefit to a tribe, to a grant in a grant application if you have multiple tribes or communities served. So you might have a better shot at getting resources. On the other hand, you may find that your goals and your approach are different. You might have different areas of concern or topics you want to look at. The timing could be affected if you work in a collaborative group. It might just take a little more time to coordinate. So that's really sort of up to you as well. Also, you think about whether or not you want a vulnerability assessment to focus on weaknesses or strengths. And so this is coming up a lot in the literature. A lot of times a vulnerability assessment, like a hazard mitigation plan, is very risk focused, which means, where are our weaknesses? And it's important to know where those are because you want to be able to reduce, mitigate, eliminate those, protect against them. But what some vulnerability assessments don't do is similarly look at strengths. So as you're investigating where your opportunities are, you may find that your community has a special capacity for some kind of a strategy or some kind of something on its side to help protect it against some of the climate impacts that are coming. And so in a vulnerability assessment, you could actually look for both risks as well as strengths so that you're better prepared to really dive in on where you're going to invest your time in your adaptation plan for new strategies. And then the process, like I said, the process varies. And so what we're going to do today is just start walking through the steps that we've come up with that really just try to boil down what we've seen in the best practices and suggest those for you with the acknowledgement that you may do things slightly differently, and that's great. Okay. All right, so we generally talk in the vulnerability assessment phase, we talk about 6 steps. And so today we're really just going to go over the first couple. And so the first is determine objectives and scope. So really just kind of what are you doing in this process, kind of getting your head and your resources around the task at hand. And the second is engage the community. And so we're going to spend quite a bit of time on those topics. And then in the next session, we're going to go over the remainder. We're going to go over identifying key indicators, gathering and analyzing information. So that's where we're going to talk a lot about data. And then prioritizing vulnerabilities. So that's where community actually gets to determine and rank what vulnerabilities are most significant for them. And then at the end, synthesizing and presenting results. But I do want to mention that that's sort of optional because some communities will actually combine a vulnerability assessment with an adaptation plan in one report. And so though these things typically do go in order, you assess your risks first, then you figure out what to do about them. You don't have to have this break in the process. You can put both together in the same report. And I've seen that plenty. One of the benefits in doing them separately is you get this pause point where you can make sure that your entire community is on board with you and you get a decision point to move forward. And that could help leverage additional buy-in and whatever resources you may need. But we will come to that place when we get there. Let's focus on the first couple of steps today. And part of what I want to do here is also introduce you to some of the companion tools that the Tribal Climate Health Project has developed for you. And so as we were developing this curriculum and it became very apparent that there's a lot of information to cover in the curriculum, and one of the best things we could do for tribes trying to do this work is to not just give them the information about how to do it, but where we can kind of lift some of the burden off of them by providing templates and tools and resources to sort of basically economize or accelerate the process of getting through these steps. And so as we go through, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these tools. So one is a resource clearinghouse, and that if you've ever been to our Tribal Climate Health Project website, that's one of the main features on that website. And so I actually want to just take a pause here and show you how to navigate the website for a moment to find some of these tools, and then we're going to go through those first 2 steps and tell you how those relate to the tools. Okay. Let's see here. I'm going to go here. So if you're actually on your computer, and you can certainly go to the tribalclimatehealth.org website. It's a pretty basic website. A lot of what it was dedicated for in the beginning was to develop a resource clearinghouse, but it also now is a home for the other tools and trainings and information that we've produced. So the resource clearinghouse at this point it's there for you if you are looking to do any kind of research, kind of literature review, if you're looking for examples from different tribes. And so it's kind of all things tribal, climate, and health related. And it gives you an opportunity to search and also to sort and look at specific topics. So you can look at, you can search by topic, so from health to health strategies, material, with the kind of materials that are available. So maybe you want to look at vulnerability risk assessment trainings and tools, or maybe you want to look at case studies. What kind of resource type? So you can look for, maybe you want to see an essay, maybe you want to see a fact sheet, maybe you want to see a database or a website. So lots of different ways to cut it. Also, you can do so by area served. If you want to look specifically at maybe for vulnerability assessments in your region, you can do that. So there's other ways to look, and then just to mention too that there's also a resources map if you want to look geographically at where there are certain resources, and so you can drill down in to where resources exist for your community. And we're continually updating this, and as you come across resources you think we could benefit from sharing with others, please go ahead and send them our way. But that's one place to start if you're looking to do some specific research on this topic. Okay, and all the rest of these we're actually going to have a place to talk about, so let's move into the steps. Okay, so step one is determine objectives and scope. And so the first question I usually have, if a community brings me in, for example, to help them with the vulnerability assessment, I usually like to ask, did you get specific direction that, from your council? And so a lot of times no, sometimes yes. And if there is direction, then you certainly want to pay attention to that as you start to figure out the objectives and scope of the vulnerability assessment. And if you haven't gotten any direction, then it isn't too late as you begin the process to get some direction, or to at least ensure that you've got the buy-in to complete this process with your tribal leadership. And so ITEP comes in handy here. ITEP produced a resolution that's a template, and that's what's here up on the right. And so you could use this and modify it as much as you'd like to make sure that you've got the direction that you need to proceed. And so this could help you look at, you can use this to say, we want to look at this specific topic. You can use this to say, to outline who's responsible. So maybe the environmental department is going to be responsible for this task. Maybe you want to set a timeline in here. There's all sorts of ways that you can give yourself the direction that you need. And so just to let you know where this is on our website, this is a slide, but I'm actually just going to go right to the website again. Did it close out? I must have. Okay, so going back to Tribal Climate Health, and there's a lot of materials that are going to come in handy for you on the section that's called training materials. And so you'll see a whole bunch of slide, these are presentations. But here's where you can find right here the tribal resolution template, and that just links over to ITEP's resolution template. And so, some of the things we built, other things we're just saying, this is great, use this. All right. Okay, so another part of step one, you're determining objectives of scope, is to designate lead staff. So somebody's kind of got to take the lead here, and it's best if it's as clear as possible whose responsibility this is. So maybe it gets delegated to a department director. Maybe that department director delegates it to a key project manager. So it's clear to know who's responsible. And I would just state from my own experience in working with several communities, including on the inside, the authority and relationships of the person who's responsible actually really matter. So giving some thought to who's in a position to really bring folks together from potentially multiple departments and has the authority to sort of make the progress they need to make. And so this person ends up being, in some cases, sort of the internal champion, just to make sure that the steps continue in a timely order and doesn't get stuck. And so this person may have a good relationship with tribal council, may have a good relationship with other departments, may have a good relationship with outside agencies, because there will be meetings that need to be facilitated and conducted, and somebody who's good at bringing folks together and leading them through a process would be great at this role. You also want to look at your resources, capacity, and limitations. So obviously, this is no small task necessarily. Even if you limit the topic of the vulnerability assessment, you still need time and expertise in order to complete the vulnerability assessment. And so you want to take a look at, hopefully you have some kind of allocated budget for this, and that could come from your tribe, it could come from grants. And so that may be where a lot of you are interested in doing this work, is maybe you see an opportunity to obtain some grant dollars to do it, and those do exist. And so you also want to look at your capacity. So say you have a really small tribal, environmental department of one person, or small team, and though there might be some knowledge on the team, you may need to bring in some additional capacity from outside folks, or maybe hire up a new person. And then there are certain limitations, and like I said before, your grant may come with some of those. You may have certain things that you are supposed to look at versus others. And so here's a discussion topic for us, and I'm hoping anybody who's interested can chime in. And just wondering if anybody's willing to share how you successfully obtained dollars to conduct climate planning work. And if you did receive those dollars, were there any limitations or stipulations that sort of guided the scope of that project?
So for this, you don't need to be wordy about it. If you'd like to just throw down where you might have obtained some funding, whether that's from your own tribal government or tribal economic development resources, what grants you might have obtained. And then of course, the second part of that question, were there limits or stipulations? So as people think about what they want to put in that question box about where they've gotten some of their money, I will say one of the limitations of some of the funding that we've gotten is that we can't use the funding to pay for food. And if you're going to try to put people into a room together from your community to talk about these issues, you have to feed them. So that can be a little bit of a barrier, or sometimes you can't even pay for a space for some of that stuff to take place. So it does make it challenging. They just want you to pay for staff or resources, and they're not necessarily looking at some of the other issues that you need to spend some money on, or resources you need to spend money on. So that can be frustrating at times. So far, nobody wants to give away where they've gotten their money because they're afraid of somebody else coming in and getting it.
Understood. Okay, well, there are a couple places to get vulnerability assessment dollars, but actually, as we get into adaptation planning, there's a lot more, because adaptation, when you do your adaptation plan and when you implement those strategies, those come from all over the board. So you could be looking at health agencies, you could look at transportation agencies, you could look at FEMA. So the work in actually adapting might be a slightly different thing than vulnerability planning, which is pretty specific and has some specific funding sources.
Well, and I'll just throw mine out there real quickly. I've gotten money from EPA, from the BIA, from FEMA, from the National Indian Health Board. And we've also got some Bureau of Reclamation money that's specific to drought adaptation. But if you're in the Southwest, then drought adaptation is climate change adaptation. So there's a lot of possibilities out there.
So part of step one is also to set the parameters of the assessment. So we've kind of talked about the approach. So now you kind of have to make some decisions about that approach. So in what time frame do you need to complete it by? You might have a deadline. It might be grant related. It might not. What boundaries are you looking at? Are you just looking at a specific part of your reservation? If you have a reservation, are you looking at a larger area? Are you looking off reservation? Is there a few trust property? You have to just define a boundary. What exposures of concern are you interested in? Meaning, maybe we only, we know that melting ice is not an issue for us, so that's not on our table, but we definitely want to look at wildfire, drought, and heat. So your community generally knows. And next time, I'm not going to show you this today, but the main tool that we've built as part of this training is called the Exposures, Impacts, and Strategies Inventory. And it's a big inventory of all the exposures, all the impacts tied relationally to each other, to regions, and to indicators and data sets that are valuable to you. So this is our big way to try to accelerate the process of you getting access to the information you need. But it can actually even come in handy here, because that giant inventory you can look at to really look at, all right, well, what exposures and impacts do I think are going to be relevant to my region? But we'll show you, we'll do a whole demo of that next time. And then your key assets, you might want to do some inventorying of what key assets are important to you. And so some communities may just want to say, I want to look at my tribal administrative building exclusively. I don't know why, but maybe there's some critical building, your fire building, that you want to look at. Okay, so back to that website on the training materials. If you want to go and download the Exposures, Impacts, and Strategies inventory tool, you can do that, or you can wait till next time when I'm actually going to be doing a whole demo. Okay. So last thing on step 1, and this really brings us over to step 2, is to determine objectives and scope. So we identify, part of what you do here is identifying potential roles of necessary staff, contractors, advisors, partners, stakeholders. So basically start thinking about who out there might have a role in your planning process, because the next step is going to be to start engaging the right people. And this is just a plug for collaborations. Though you may do a solo vulnerability assessment, meaning not doing it with other organizations or other tribes, if you collaborating with the right partners can increase the implementation viability of adaptation plans, can leverage knowledge and resources from multiple agencies, and can develop solutions that are grounded in shared values and understanding. So that's just a plug to, it can be very alluring to get through the process quickly and have a really small team and to not make a big stink of it or to keep things under the radar. However, in the long run, you want as much buy-in and as much support as you can get, and doing that early on can be really helpful. So let's talk about engaging the community. And I'm hoping that folks, as we talk about this, can be putting in the question box what methods work best to get meaningful input from your community. And so there's some reasons to engage the community. One of them is to gather knowledge, oral histories and stories, observations and data from community members and other stakeholders. You also want to learn about the concerns in your community and any existing resilience and preparedness activities. When I go and talk to a community, I usually come in knowing very little. Even the staff that may be working in that community for a long, long time could learn a lot by talking with the folks in their community about what's already been done and what their concerns are. And so it will help you to determine what community assets are most valued and important to protect. And if you are interested in coordinating regionally, it could make technical analysis more cost effective. You'll also be engaging community members at the point at which you have findings and drafts that you may want to be reviewed by your community. And so let's talk about what do we mean by community? And did anybody respond to that question, Shasta?
No, but again, if you have any specific suggestions about engaging members of the community, things that have worked, things that haven't worked, feel free to throw them into that question box. And we may also develop that as a subject in our Google group that people can put in there. Because I can tell you personally, I have a hard time with it, but I know that some people are just great at gathering people. So if you can do that, that would be very, very helpful to share those ideas.
So there are a lot of ways to engage the community, but some of them have different purposes. So we always recommend to have a planning team, and so that might be a smaller, more intimate group of people. It might even be that you have a core planning team. For example, when we were in Paula, it was Paula's environmental department that and Prosper Sustainably that formed sort of the core planning team. And then we invited a larger group of folks from different departments to be part of the internal planning team. So you might think about which departments are really critical to invite, and maybe Shasta, could you share with folks what departments you thought were really critical to be part of that team?
So we have several departments, and some of them weren't automatically popping into my head, but they came up later. So some of the obvious ones were our utilities department, providing, in our case, water and waste management services. And then our tribal services department, who goes out to help residents with things like cleanups in their yards, but also does things like trims trees and does flood mitigation projects when there's heavy rains. Our tribal law enforcement staff were very important, as were our fire department. So those were the ones that I thought of automatically. But then as time went by, I realized it would be useful to engage both our youth center staff and our community library, because that's where a lot of community members go. That's where we could find the kids, that's where we could find people who are interested in education and research, and then also our seniors, because the seniors and the kids working together, the seniors are worried about what world they're leaving behind for their grandkids, and for the grandkids, it's kind of like, well, grandma says I got to go to this thing. So, so it's good to engage those multi-generational relationships, and also children and seniors are some of our more vulnerable communities. So getting buy-in from those departments was really important for our engagement.
And so you might also consider bringing in trusted outside advisors too to your planning team. And so some of you might have access to a university that you have a good relationship with, that you bring folks in. Maybe they have a special, climate group. There's also regional climate centers that are under NOAA that are specifically designed to provide technical assistance to communities. And so you could reach out to them, and they may be able to provide a lot of help and technical assistance in terms of information gathering. And then this is a plug, because this is a health related training that certainly involve health in those, to the extent you can, in your planning teams. You might have an internal community health staff person, or local clinic staff, or folks from the Tribal Epidemiology Center in your region may be willing to hop on board. Or even if you have a good relationship, you might consider the county epidemiologist, because those folks can really come in handy in developing information for you, and also developing ideas and recommendations for strategies later on. And then, so that's your planning team, and that's super critical, because you'll use them throughout the rest of the steps that we talk about. And then community members, you could have community members, maybe representatives, be part of your planning team, or you could have community members have their own kind of engagement process. And so I talk about things in terms of active and passive engagement. Active engagement with community members would mean there's sort of a two-way engagement, meaning you're sharing information and you're asking for feedback or input back. And then there's passive engagement, which would mean you're sort of just informing. You're providing information for folks that would like to consume it. And so here's a couple on the right, a couple of examples. So Tribal Climate Health Project developed a survey template that can help folks who want to go do active engagement as a survey. It's on a Google form. You can go to the Tribal Climate Health website under training materials, so that same web page, download it, develop a copy for yourself, and customize it as much as you'd like. But basically, it helps you obtain some really critical information about experiences, perspectives, concerns, and priorities from community members. You can also not just do a survey. You could use those same questions to gather information in the form of workshops or interviews as well. And then here's an example on the bottom right. This is Paula's environmental department webpage on climate change. And they did a beautiful job. And we just are sharing it as an example of one way to share information with your community through a website. They also have a really good social media activity. They're on Facebook. They share all sorts of interesting information, including disaster emergency information when necessary, and climate information. So that's where to find that survey, and you can copy it and link that, or you can save and copy it for yourself. And here's some of the survey results that we get from the survey we developed. So we can learn more about which climate exposures people are concerned about. This community was most concerned about wildfire. You can learn about what secondary exposures they're most concerned about. This community was more concerned about water insecurity than anything else. And then there's a whole section where they have to rank community assets, and so you get a good idea of what assets are the most important. And so in this case, the community was most concerned about water resources. And you also can get some good quotes out of this survey like this, or use ours. And so, for example, a survey respondent said, "I'm worried about fires in our area. The dry brush on our reservation is extreme." The survey could also ask about, what culturally important species are there that are important. So you can get a lot of information out of engaging your community. And I use this information directly in a vulnerability assessment, and I use it to make this help a community make decisions. So I think we're low on time. So what I'm going to do, this is actually a little clip, and I'm going to send this out to the group afterwards. This is Mike Chan from the Makah tribe, who did a nice job of doing community engagement. He was interviewed by the University of Washington. That's did a lot of really good tribal resilience work. And I'll send this out afterwards just so you can hear an example from another tribe up in Washington about how they're doing their community engagement in their adaptation planning process. And then this is actually from Paula, and this is just to show you the depth of which they are doing their collaborative engagement processes for climate change. So PED, the environmental department's there in the middle. They've included a Paula adaptation planning team in the next circle. The next circle is what they consider Planet Paula, which is their community engagement group, where they actually bring community members in to talk about climate and environmental issues. They also have a regional intertribal working group for climate change, where they work with tribes throughout Southern California. And beyond that, to share and collaborate nationally, they have the Tribal Climate Health Project. So lots of spheres of influence here. All right, so that's it for today. Did want to do a little shout out that we'll be at the Tribal Region 9 Tribal Conference on October 24th, talking specifically about tools and resources for efficient fact finding. And we do have a few, we have a suggestion for reading for the next time. I would like to ask you to scan one of the following vulnerability assessments. And so we'll be sending links out after this to these 3 vulnerability assessments. Just scan them so you get an idea what might go into a vulnerability assessment report. And that's it for today. So the next webinar is November 5th, and we're going to go over the second part of vulnerability assessments. Anything else for today, Shasta?
No, just one brief comment from Aaron that he's had difficulty getting getting health professionals in his area to engage because they have so much of their own work to do. So I said I'd throw that out there on the Google group to see if others have advice about how they've handled similar circumstances. So thank you all, and I'll get these materials out onto the website in the next couple of days.
All right, thanks all, bye.
Bye everybody.